So, Steve, let's have a look at modern monetary theory, because it has been discussed a lot by governments the world over, because they've all needed money, obviously, to fund their COVID-19 rescue efforts. Enough discussions been going on, in fact, for it to be discounted by many politicians. I mean, and you mentioned it in one of your recent posts, that there was a motion raised in the US Congress in the United States saying it is the duty of the House of Representatives to condemn modern monetary theory. So there's a lot of opposition to it, and it's all that opposition is always, it seems, that argument that, hey, you know, if we have modern monetary theory in practice, we're going to see runaway inflation. That's the argument always used, I think.
Yeah, the trouble is that we actually have it already, because at least at the level of describing how finances work at the very basic level of how do you create money, and how does it get distributed, we're already practicing it, because it is literally a description of the existing system. Yeah. And to say we shouldn't have it is saying we shouldn't have our existing system. Now, there's people who agree with you on that front, like Positive Money, who want to ban private money creation. But the reality of modern monetary theory, as it's stated, and I've now done a Minsky model of the basic dynamics, it's just describing what the financial flows are in a capitalist economy with private banks and with the government. But when people are arguing against it, aren't they arguing against the side that, you know, the money isn't paid back? So in effect, the debts with modern monetary theory, debts are sort of written off, aren't they? Whereas if you let's look at what's happening with the Fed, for example, just the size of the Fed's balance sheet. In 2008, it was about $1 trillion. Before the crisis, it was $4 trillion. Now it's $7 trillion, and we know that's never going to be paid back, because how do you pay back $7 trillion? And we know that when we've had quantitative easing, where the bonds have been issued by the treasury and the central bank has bought it, the intention is that at some point they will get them off their balance sheet and put it back into the money markets. But we know when they've tried that, it hasn't happened. So that is modern monetary theory, isn't it? In effect, except we're perhaps going through the banking system. And why do we need to do that if we accept that the money is never going to be paid back? No, that is not modern monetary theory. All right, okay. Well, there are hence the misunderstanding for it. Well, that's the practice of what's happening right now. Anyway, what really is the problem is everybody has an opinion about the monetary system, and only myself working from the credit end, Richard Werner as well, and people like Ann Pettifors and Francis Coppola from that end, and then at the other end, the government perspective, the modern monetary people, Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, have given different perspectives on the monetary system. So I've focused on the credit side of things. Modern monetary theory is focused upon government money creation. We're trying to put I'm trying to put the elephant together now and say this is the overall pattern of how money is created. And one point where I have to admit I got it wrong, and I've only realised that I was wrong, first of all, reading Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, and then by putting it into a Minsky model, is that one point modern monetary theory says is the government doesn't need to sell bonds to raise the money. The government creates the money by running a deficit, and it's only a requirement of Congress or a Parliament and whatever else that they issue bonds to cover that difference. Yeah. My feeling was, my logic, as you know, I've talked about this on many an occasion. Banks create money by lending more than they get back in repayments. Yeah, okay? And that's something which is, once you accept that money is created by banks, that they don't take in deposits and lend them out again, the textbook model, which the Bank of England, Bundesbank, several other central banks have said is wrong. After 50 or 60 years of rebel economists like myself saying that it's wrong, finally we can quote an authority like the Bank of England and say it's wrong. Banks originate loans. When they create a loan, they put an entry on the asset side of their ledger, which is the debt you now owe to them, and an entry on the liability side. The only reason you accept the debt is they've put money in your bank account. If there wasn't an identical, if a bank says, we're going to lend you 900,000 quid and you're going to owe us $1 million to start with, you would say, no deal, sorry. Okay, I'll accept $1 million loan if I get $1 million. Okay, so there's a one-for-one correspondence between creation of debt and money in your account. Debt creates money.
But that's from the commercial banks.
That's from the commercial banks, yeah.
But we also have money being created by governments through, and whether it's right or wrong, right now that money has been created through the issuance of bonds, which are the
no.
Okay. Well,
and again, like I've had to learn this myself. Okay.
Right.
One of the we've forgotten who actually said it. It's probably Albert Einstein or Mark Twain or one of the favourite characters for great sayings. But the best way to understand something is to start by not understanding it.
Right. Okay.
Well, there. And you're there, mate. You're there.
but me, along with most of the finance industry,
most of the population, and this is the problem. So, one thing, if I want to go right back on my own history, when I was first building models of monetary dynamics, I didn't accept that repaying a debt would destroy money. It just didn't make sense to me. If a bank creates money, it's not going to want to destroy money, and that was my starting point. Then when I put the double and triple keeping together, I found when you see what money actually is, you define money, it is fundamentally what's in your bank accounts plus cash.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can leave cash out of the picture and just say, well, let's just say it's just bank accounts. You repay your debt by saying to the bank, I'm going to give you, let's say you've got $1 million in your bank account. Let's be fantastical here. You've got $1 million in your bank account. You owe the bank $100,000. You say, I'm going to transfer $100,000 to the bank. And the bank then says, okay, we're going to reduce your debt by $100,000 from $100,000 to zero. So when your deposit account goes down, so does your debt. So repaying, in the sense of when the sum of all deposit accounts is money, then repaying the debt reduces the amount of money. So in that sense, repaying a debt destroys money. That's the shorthand which people like Graziani and Minsky used, that I didn't think they were right. I found ultimately they were correct, and my gut feeling was wrong. So when you look at modern monetary theory, the argument made by modern monetary theory is the very act of running a deficit creates money.
Right.
Okay? The creation is actually the deficit itself,
but
not whether you sell bonds.
Right, but that is the vehicle, isn't it? It doesn't have to be, but that is the vehicle. Right now, if the Treasury, which has racked up $7 trillion in debt, they've created that debt by issuing bonds, haven't they? They've turned it in. This is where Stephanie uses in her book. That's what's happening. That's the reality.
That's what's happening. But the point which I've realised, again, just in the last couple of weeks, so it's hardly stuff I'm going to knock you for not having worked out yourself, is that if you're going to create money, let's think about when the bank does it. What's going on is there's an increase in the asset side of the bank, and there's an increase in the liability side of the bank.
Yeah.
Okay. Assets rise, liabilities rise.
Even for a central bank.
Well, even for a central bank. If there's an operation that hits both the asset side and the liability side, then you increase the assets, you therefore either increase the liability or the equity.
Right, okay. But we're not. But when we're talking about government debt, we're not talking about a bank, though, are we? We're talking about the government has said we are racking up debt of $7 trillion. We've spent $7 trillion that we. But what is it? And the assets will be whatever it might be. We've built a motorway, or we've built a bunch of hospitals, or we've.
Yeah, but how do you build a motorway? You put money in the bank accounts of people laying on the blacktop, to quote old Bruce Springsteen. So the actually way you pay for that is you make a deposit in the bank accounts of people who are out there laying down the blacktop.
Right.
And that increases the bank. That's increasing a liability account for the private banking system, and it's increased through the reserves. So the liability.
So the example of the US, the government put $1,200 into everyone's bank account. That was a cost to the government, but it was also an asset for those people who received that.
Yeah. So they get $1,200. So their bank accounts rise by $1,200. What happens on the asset side of the banking sector? Reserves rise by $1,200.
Mm.
Okay. Now, since they've risen by $1,200, that's actually created the money. The increase in the asset and the increase in the liability together, that creates the money. Now, where does the sale of bonds come into it? Okay. Well, if the central bank was financed, well, you've got to go one level higher again and say what's happening at the level of the central bank, because what's happened there is the Treasury has spent money out of its deposit account, which means its deposit, which its liability to the central bank has gone up. Now, how is that liability at the central bank managed? Well, the central bank could give the government a loan directly, which is what's actually happening in the UK right now as well. So
that's right, if the central bank gets involved. But if the government believed it could sell $7 trillion worth of bonds on the money markets, it would do that, wouldn't it? So so the government says, I'm going to give you $1,200 to go into your bank account, and I'm going to issue $1,200 in bonds, and somebody else buys those $1,200 in bonds. So in effect, they've been buying something that is finding itself in my bank account. Without the central bank stepping in, but the central bank steps in because there's just such a sheer volume. There's concern that it will all be sold on the money markets effectively without influencing the interest rates.
No. This is we should do actually maybe just do a vidcast on this one, and maybe have the Patreon audience on as well at some point to cover it. And it allows share screening as well. But we haven't actually got share screen going here, so I can't actually share you and show you the double entry bookkeeping that I'm working with. But the way that I've come to understand this is that to create money, you have to act on both the liability and the asset side of the private banks. Now, they themselves do that through loans and repayments. When the government does it, it's making a deposit into somebody's bank account, which increases the bank liabilities. That turns up as an increase in the reserves of the bank, which is an increase in the bank's assets. Yeah. So what happens is running a deficit creates reserves on the asset side of the bank. And with that creation of reserves, you then have the banks who don't necessarily want these reserves because they can't lend them out. We know that's a wrong theory. They can't lend those reserves out. And if there's no interest being paid on reserves by the central bank, remember, reserves are a deposit of the private banks at the central bank. If there's no interest being paid by the central bank on reserves, then it's a dead asset for the banking sector. So what then happens is the government, the Treasury says, we will issue bonds to finance that. And you give the banks a choice. Do you want to hold your assets in reserves which earn no interest? Or do you want to hold your assets in Treasury bonds which earn an interest rate? Well, the bank says, I'll take the interest rate, thanks. So what they do is they use the reserves which have been created by the deficit to buy the bonds. And they then swap a non-interest earning asset, which is the reserves, for an interest earning asset, which is the Treasury bonds. And that's what's actually going on. So, and this is one point which Stephanie hammers in the deficit myth, and which most of the deficit myth, of course, is second nature to me. I'm used to working in it. There was nothing revelationary. The one point where I had to say, right, I hadn't worked that out. When people ask me, does the government deficit create money? I would say to the extent to which the central bank buys the bonds. That turns out to be wrong. It is simply the deficit itself that creates the money. The sale of Treasury bonds to the private banks is an asset swap so far as the private banks are concerned, because they go from one thing on their asset side, which is the reserves that earns no interest, to another thing on the asset side, which does earn interest. It's simply an asset swap for them. And there's no money creation by them. It's simply reallocating from the reserves to the Treasury bonds. And then if the central bank buys the bonds through open market operations off the private banks, that is simply taking those assets off the private banks and giving them reserves once more. But it's reducing the amount of money the Treasury has to pay in interest payments to the private banks. So there is no sense in which the government needs to sell the bonds to finance itself, since it has the central bank, which can do that anyway by making a loan to it. So the only reason the rules are there in that sense are so that the Treasury has to maintain a positive or a non-negative balance of the central bank. But it all ends up being created because the Treasury can handle having negative equity. This is my generalisation of the point of modern monetary theory, where they say the government deficit is the private sector surplus. That's a flow at a point in time.
So
what that means, yeah.
So I'm being very slow on this, but I suspect a lot of other people will be slow on it too. Yeah. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'm the only one, and everyone else is way.
No. Believe me, mate. I took a while to get here too.
So the government spends $1 trillion or $2 trillion. So you say they get another wave of stimulus, which they want it to find its way ultimately into people's bank accounts because they want people to spend to keep the economy moving. So that money will find its way into commercial banks. So you're saying it's an asset for the commercial banks, which raises the question, why not just put the money straight into those bank accounts? But they don't do that. They issue bonds and then the banks buy the bonds.
Well, no, it's a question of when they issue the bonds. I mean, there can be time lags when the bonds can be issued after the tax is spent. You can actually have the bond sales preceding. You can anticipate what the necessary requirements might be. So you sell bonds in advance. But the overall, the bond operation itself doesn't create any money. The operation that creates the money is running a deficit in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. So that was my sort of point. Does it make any difference whether they actually say, well, okay, let's just put the money directly into people's bank accounts, or whether we actually issue bonds and then the bonds get bought by the banks? Makes no difference whatsoever.
No. The only difference it makes is that if the government sells treasury bonds, then the banking sector has income earning assets, and the income that they earn is interest paid by the Treasury, and fundamentally the Treasury borrows that from the central bank. So the Treasury is going into negative equity to pay the interest on bonds, and that is partly what pushes up the equity of the banking sector.
Right.
So that's one necessary. There's one reason you might actually want to do that when you had a financial crisis going, because the equity of the private banks is being trashed during a financial crisis.
Okay, let's simplify this even further. You are the entire American population, and I am the entire American government. I lend you $1 trillion. You've got $1 trillion now. You owe me that $1 trillion, don't you? I want to get it back at some point.
No, because when a government gives money, it doesn't say, here's $1 trillion, by the way, you owe us $1 trillion. That's a bank. Okay. When a government,
but that's the way. But that's the thinking, though, isn't it? That's the way governments and the general population thinks. If the government gives money, it's got to give back. Yeah, I mean, we're in deficit. We're $7 trillion in deficit. We've got to get that back somehow. And the point is, obviously, that won't happen.
Yeah, because again, this is modern monetary theory's point about a deficit. It's the negative. The deficit for the government sector becomes a surplus for the private sector. So that's the flow. With Minsky, I can look at the stocks. I can say, if those flows continue over time, what happens to the stock of outstanding debt and the stock of money? And the result is, in terms of money created by the government sector, the amount of private government debt outstanding is precisely equal to how much government money is being created. So if you say you want to get rid of the debt, you're saying let's get rid of the money. And that's not what people want at all.
Right, but that is what people are saying. So when you have that motion that I talked about, which is saying that it's going to create runaway inflation, I mean that's a common belief, and that belief.
Well, that is feasibly true. I mean, when it comes to what the consequences are of that government money creation, then it could well be that it drives inflationary pressures when you don't want
too much money. Yeah.
Or it goes into asset markets where you don't want it. It doesn't go into the physical economy, et cetera, et cetera. Those are issues of the amount being created, but it's, again, as modern monetary theory argues, it's the consequences of the action rather than the feasibility of the action. When you look at the accounting, it's not only is it a feasible thing for the government to run a deficit, it's a necessary thing for the government to be in negative equity if you want the non-government, not the private sector, to be in positive equity. And so
So the role of central banks in all of this, so it sounds like they're not necessarily needed if we knew where we wanted the money to end up. But we don't know precisely. When we say, well, we're going to introduce some sort of government stimulus measures, we might say, well, okay, a slug of it's going to go directly into people's bank accounts, and we know what those bank accounts are. But by and large, we've not got a mechanism, have we, if we're pumping money into the economy? So I'm assuming sort of like the idea of the bond markets is if we've got some sort of finance industry intermediary, that there's a mechanism that is magically somehow going to ensure that money finds itself into the place where it's most needed.
The central bank is necessary in the sense that you need to act as a government. You've got to own your own bank.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, and again, I'll be explaining this more in a couple of future blog posts on the Patreon site. But one of the surprising results I got was that my expectation again was that if I modeled the relationship between the Treasury and the central bank, and then the central bank and the private sector, and the Treasury and the private sector, and so on, I expected I'd find the central bank goes into negative equity. And I was going to say, well, then the central bank can handle being a negative equity, unlike a private bank. But much to my amazement, all the equity effects turned up on the Treasury's books, not on the central bank. So the central bank ended up with neutral effects on its, nothing changed its equity. The entity that carried the negative equity of running a deficit over time to enable the non-government sector to be in surplus was the Treasury. So, and then the question is, does anybody audit the Treasury? The Treasury can cope with negative equity. You and I can't.
Right, but I don't understand how that works. If I'm the government and you're the entire American population, I give you $1 trillion. How do I get equity sitting on my books? I've given the money away to you. That's
right. You're in negative equity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
You've put an asset. You've given people money. In effect, if you look at it like a seesaw, you've said you guys need to be higher up. I'm going to sit further out and push you up. And your going negative pushes them positive.
Yeah.
Okay. So you think of a seesaw, and when I look at how people try to think about it without seeing all the double entry interlocking accounting systems that we actually live in, they're saying we want both sides to be up of a seesaw.
Mm. So when you get up too high, that's when I try and pull you back down by taxing you or stopping that.
But there's another little thing I've got to work on the mathematics of shortly, and that is a very simple thing. The general belief people have, and neoclassical economists that knock us all the time, government should run a deficit during bad times and a surplus during good times. And if you ask a neoclassical what should be the deficit over time, they'd say, well, a balanced budget. That's a fairly common belief. Mm. If you have a balanced budget and you have a growing economy, then over time your government sector will go to zero.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have a growing economy, you want to have a government running a deficit so the government remains in much the same ratio it is now. Right? This is something I haven't had a chance to play with yet on the mathematics, but I presume it means that once you admit you're in a growing economy, if you see the economy growing at roughly 3% per annum, then you want a government deficit of 3% to be your median, not what happens during a slump. You want the average over time to be a 3% deficit to maintain government at, say, 30% of GDP.
And if you're hitting times like this where you're obviously spending well above that 3%, you're not getting inflation because we're not seeing, there's just not buying going on because there's a crisis going on. So you want to pull back once you see people starting to spend again. So that's when we're pulling you back down on the seesaw that you're talking about. But it's still not necessarily going to be running a surplus. No, okay, it's going to be a 3%
extraordinary.
Deficit.
No, it'll be a smaller deficit, not a larger. Because again, the deficit is creating the money the rest of us use to spend. And this is one reason that I like the government being involved in neutral ways of creating money, like, for example, financing university fees and school fees, paying for universal health care. We all need those things. We can see what happens when you have to pay for them. You get the sort of disasters we're seeing in America with COVID right now. So there's no argument for the private sector to do the actual billing. You'd rather say, let's have the government create the money, the government spend it, and you decide which health services you need at the time, along with some pandemic insurance. That is a better way to go about it than the usual picture that people have bureaucrats telling you what to do.
But so whatever the magic figure is, say it is 3% deficit, averaged out 3%, the government can run in effect, what we'll call a 3% deficit every year. In other words, they're spending 3% more than they're getting back in tax or from what other revenue sources they have. So that's going to expand the money supply by 3%. Well, 3% plus whatever the commercial banks do as well.
That's right. Yeah.
They don't have, because you don't have control. So you can use that and say, well, okay, we've got control of the economy by controlling what that deficit is. You don't have control of the commercial banks, of course, and what they do in terms of extending their loans, which
this is one reason with Minsky I can do something which modern monetary theory itself hasn't yet done, and that's integrate its logic about government spending with what the banks do. Again, Stephanie, in the book, I saw her challenged on Twitter recently about why don't you talk about private banks, and she said it's because it's a book about government money creation. So she's not saying that it doesn't matter. She's saying it's not something I covered in that book, and that's quite a legitimate claim to make. But what I can do with Minsky is include that in the system. And what you find is if the government tries to run a surplus, which I can set up in the model, and I'll show this in a future paper, a future blog post on Patreon. If they run a surplus, that puts the private sector in an identical deficit. So the private sector seeing its money supply fall. The economy, when you're running a surplus, will normally shrink. Now, what we see in the real world is, oh dear, the government's running a surplus. The economy expanded. The 1920s. Wasn't that a fabulous decade? Every year of this 1920s, Calvin Coolidge ran a 1% of GDP surplus and raved about how well the economy is performing. With my model, they're saying the economy should have been going down. What's the countering factor? The private sector borrowed like effing crazy from the private banks. And when I put the two together, I have the government running a surplus and lots of borrowing from the private banking sector. You can get a booming economy, but that's coming at the expense of an increased level of private debt. Now, one reason why you'll borrow that money from private banks when the government's running a surplus is your money supply is falling.
Yeah. So Douglas Adams, of course, weighed into all of this, didn't he, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? But I think you'll say he's wrong. Brilliant books, but he's wrong on this, because he gave the example of the management consultant explaining how on a planet somewhere the leaf was adopted as the legal tender, and everyone was incredibly rich because there were so many of them, and then inflation kicked in due to the high level of leaf availability, and so 3 deciduous trees would buy 1 peanut, for example. So they burnt down all the forests because that seemed like the logical thing to do. Sort of
we're talking Golga Fringians here, who are the only people who make Donald Trump look smart.
Exactly. Well, and I mean, the fact is they if they'd started with 1 tree and then they'd grown the tree available, the leaf availability at a steady pace, 3% per year, for example.
Well, they were the people who said to Douglas Adams at one stage, okay, no, it was a Ford prefect, wasn't it? Okay, if you're so smart, you tell us what colour the wheel should be.
Exactly. Important questions like that. But look, what is the edge of this approach? So if we have another wave of the virus, and we will have it, and so governments have to spend trillions again, and then maybe trillions again, 6 months later, do we get inflation, or do we get to a point where the government is issuing so much debt or creating so much money? Let's not call it debt, but they're creating so much money. And we're already seeing, as we talked about last week, people turning to gold and the devaluation of the US dollar because there is just so much of it being created. Almost getting back by default to sort of like gold standard days, aren't we? Where the idea of fiat currency is getting challenged because people are looking for something solid.
No, again, let's look at the Second World War. That's probably the best analogy we've got for the COVID crisis. Okay, and I'm now looking at it in a different way, the way that I did before reading Stephanie's book and before building this Minsky model, and that is that the deficit, the UK deficit in 1940 was 40% of GDP. Now, it issued bonds to cover that 40% of GDP. So the feeling is the government had to go in massively in debt to finance the war effort. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had, you would be speaking German in Whitehall right now. In fact, because the deficit created the money, the sale of the bonds was effectively an asset swap for the banking sector. And that gave you a monumental increase in the level of government debt to GDP in the UK. I think it reached 350% of GDP. Okay, and the thing, how can you ever pay it back? Well, you didn't have to, because that increase in private debt, and I'm now thinking in America's data, which I know better on this front, America had equally very, very large deficits. That financed an enormous amount of private sector spending to build the tanks and to pay the wages and buy the rations and so on. And the private sector paid its debt levels down during the Second World War. So you began with this huge level of government debt, but what it really was an asset swap. for the money that had been created during the war by running deficits for the war. So it was just the fact that the money was earning interest for the banking sector because it had been issued as bonds, rather than the government was in debt to the banking sector. And they could easily pay those bonds, pay the interest, et cetera, and they're injecting money into the economy, which meant people didn't feel the need to get massively in debt.
Right. So we're going to go through the same thing again in that case. And yet, are we going to look at that $7 trillion and say, well, we've got to pay that back, which is, I mean,
which we don't,
in the UK is saying we need to start moving into that next stage. We need to start,
which we don't have to do. It is simply a case of we've created an asset for the banking sector by selling these bonds. If we hadn't sold the bonds to them, the government would have a debt to the central bank, and the banking sector would have all these excess reserves, which they can't use.
Yeah.
Because the excess reserves can't be lent.
And the other side of the equation in all of this, of course, is the fact that the government is issuing these bonds, and there is the belief that they need to be paid back at some point. Then there's every interest in trying to keep interest rates low, isn't there? Because we don't want the value of those bonds to get, or the repayments on those bonds.
But if interest rates are high,
the government has to pay more.
Yeah, but if interest rates are high, the government is providing more finance for the finance sector. Remember the old saying that the old 336 rule for banking, or 363 rule. Borrow at 3, lend at 6, and be on the golf course by 3 o'clock. Now, that's what I wish bankers were doing, rather than bloody Donald Trump doing it. But what was financing it? Well, they had such a level of government bonds; they were getting that money that way. They didn't need to be trying to rip money out of the household sector or get Ponzi schemes for the commercial world, because they were making plenty of money out of their bond holdings.
Yeah. So, but the thinking is right now would be the non-monetary theory, but the idea that it's just government debt issued as bonds, is we need low interest rates because the government is going to have to, if it's sold on the open market, then the government is having to pay the interest on those each year. So if it's a low interest rate, then it's less money that the government has to pay. The fact is, it's also less money for the finance sector who's buying those bonds. So you're right on that. But the fact that the interest rates are being kept low to perpetuate that for the foreseeable future. I mean, God, when do you pay $7 trillion back? It's going to take, if that's the thinking, that's going to take forever. And it's not healthy having low interest rates. No one saves. Everyone buys assets. It skews the economy totally.
Well, it's actually private debt that's caused interest rates to get to be that low, not government debt. And other government debt was,
but it's not going to move now because of the government debt, because there's all these bonds that have been issued.
But again, what we tend to do is focus upon, again, this is another shortcoming in how we think. We focus upon paying the debt itself down, without reducing government debt, without realizing that if you're going to run a surplus for the government, then you reduce GDP by precisely the scale of the surplus. Plus, you're taking money out of circulation, which means you have an indirect impact on GDP as well. So trying to pay the government debt down actually tends to reduce GDP even more and give you a higher debt ratio. So,
but I hear you, but all I'm saying is that is the way the thinking.
That's the mentality,
and that is the way we are operating as well. We are issuing those. We are issuing those bonds. We're keeping interest rates low so that we don't have to pay too much back on them, with the belief that at some point that they will be paid back, and that's helping to keep interest rates low for the foreseeable future. So what needs to happen is that mind shift, doesn't it? And that mind shift is, we don't want bonds. We don't need the bonds in this.
Yeah. Well, then you see the bonds as simply a way of giving the banking sector an income-earning asset rather than a non-income-earning one, which is reserves, where the excess reserves have been created by running a deficit. And that's why the bonds are always oversubscribed, because the money is sitting there earning no interest for the banks. And you say, why don't you swap them for treasury bonds that actually earn interest? Oh, yeah? Can I be number one on the list? So they always get oversubscribed. And this is why, because the deficit itself creates the money that is used to buy them. And it's simply an asset swap on the asset side of the banking sector's ledger. It's just a very sensible asset swap. That's why they'll never not subscribe to them. You're turning down free money, in the sense you're turning down interest on money you've currently got that earns no interest.
Right, and the fact that if you keep on going down the road, you're going to have more and more money. So each dollar is going to be worth less and less. but still, the choice, the same choice still applies.
Yeah. You want an income or not?
Yeah. All right. So what changes then? Very quickly, how do we change the thinking? What has to happen? What does the government need to do to say, well, okay, we are going to embrace modern monetary theory now? This is what changes.
Well, what would change is worrying about the deficit. As Stephanie's book argues, it's a myth that the deficit matters. What matters is the state of the economy, and frankly, of course, the state of the ecology as well. I'm waiting for a politician to come and say, we can't afford to save the environment, it costs too much money. Well, let's all die.
Okay, so on average, we say over a period of time that we're going to spend 3% more than we accumulate. But when times are tough, it could be considerably more than that.
10, 20, and 40% like we did during the Second World War.
What do we do then? Are we still issuing bonds then? What happens to the money that sits in the
issue? If you want to issue the bonds, the bonds provide an income source for the finance sector. They don't actually provide the money the government uses. The government creates the money by running the deficit. So it's not a case of needing to sell the bonds to cover the deficit.
But it doesn't have to be through bonds, though. It could just be straight it could just be straight transfers from the central bank to another distribution mechanism to get money out into the economy, couldn't it?
The central bank could lend the money create the money as an asset for itself, as a loan to the Treasury, and put the money in the Treasury's accounts. And of course, the Treasury owns the central bank, so there are no interest payments necessary.
Well, that sounds a better way, doesn't it? By and large,
which is again is what modern monetary theory people are arguing for. That you don't even need to provide the finance sector with interest. At the moment, I'd rather be reducing the income of the finance sector rather than increasing it. I wouldn't mind getting back to the days where they don't make a lot of money out of the private sector and they make more money out of the government. It's more sustainable than whether what the private sector in 2 and 3 times income is its debt level.
Yeah, and trying to flog home loans to people who can't afford it, and trying to push the turnover up that way. Okay. It makes a bit more sense. Are we going to reach this conclusion after when the US is at $14 trillion in debt and everyone realizes there's nowhere in the world that is ever going to be repaid?
It doesn't need to be repaid.
Yeah, doesn't need to. And doesn't need to, and won't be anyway. Even if it did, there's no way they can do that without completely destroying the economy. How would you pay back $7 trillion without? Because you would be pulling that money out of the private sector. You would destroy the economy if you did that. So there's got to be that acceptance that that's where they are right now.
Yeah, that's right. It's a record of your past history. It's not a sign that you don't have a future.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's finish on that line.
Yeah, I like that. Very good. I won't say anything then. We'll just go. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again very soon. Thanks.
Okay, mate.